Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Museum of the United States Army. We will be starting our program in just a couple of moments. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Christian B. Keller, who will be speaking to us on the great partnership, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the fate of the Confederacy. While we wait for everyone to come into the Zoom room, I've launched a poll, so if you could let us know here on day 3 if you've been to another event. If you plan to go to another event during our Civil War week, this is very helpful information for us to know. So again, we will be starting in a couple of minutes. We want to give everyone an opportunity to get their technology working here at 7 o'clock on Wednesday. Once you've answered the poll question, as many of you return attendees know, we'd love to know where you are Zooming in from. If you could use the chat, send your message to us. Where are you watching us from? And where did you hear about the program? So for those of you who are just coming in, we will be starting in just a minute or two. We're always so excited to see folks from our local area, but we're also excited to see people who are Zooming in from other countries. And of course, Charlottesville, Fredericksburg, Manassas, you were all in places that are rich, rich, rich in Civil War history. Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, friends, colleagues. Welcome to the National Museum of the United States Army. We will be starting our program momentarily. As people come into the room, we've launched a poll. You can tell us if you've been to other programs this week. I'm going to end the poll in about 5 seconds, so if you can vote. I see that we have folks who are Zooming in from really across the country. Okay. So 92% of you have been to another event this week or plan to attend another event this week. So you are all experienced Civil War week museum goers. But for those few who are joining us for the first time, we encourage you to use the chat function to talk to each other. If you can recommend a good book or a good museum or a park for folks to visit, we'd like to see that kind of information in the chat. If you have a question for the speaker, the panelist, we appreciate it if you would put that into the Q&A, and our moderator will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the evening. And speaking of our moderator, everyone, please welcome Dr. John Moss, Museum Educator.
Good evening, folks, and thank you, Elizabeth. We have a great program tonight, and I encourage you all to use the Q&A, as Elizabeth was mentioning, for questions. For comment, it would be preferable if you use the chat, but we're glad to have you all with us. We've got to have a big crowd tonight, and hopefully we'll be able to get to as many questions as possible. Again, we're glad to welcome you to Civil War Week at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. Tonight, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Christian Keller, and I am going to tell you a little bit about him. His presentation, as you can see, is about Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, based on his recent book, which is excellent. I highly recommend it. Dr. Keller is a professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses for senior leaders on the theory of war and strategy, national security policy and strategy, and the American Civil War. In 2017, he was named the General Dwight D. Eisenhower Chair of National Security, and in 2019 became the director of the Military History Program. He earned a BA from Washington and Lee University and his PhD from Penn State University in 2001. Along with many scholarly articles focusing on strategic, operational, and ethnic topics in the Civil War, he is author of Chancellorsville and the Germans, Nativism, Ethnicity, and Civil War Memory. He's the co-author of Damn Dutch, Pennsylvania Germans at Gettysburg, co-author of Pennsylvania, A Military History, and most recently, author of The Great Partnership, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the Fate of the Confederacy. Dr. Keller's next book, an edited anthology of essays on Confederate strategy, written exclusively by Army War College students and faculty, is entitled Southern Strategies, Why the Confederacy Failed. So we are again very happy to welcome Dr. Christian Keller. Chris, a very good evening to you.
Good evening to you, John, and thank you so much for that wonderful opening. I'm very, very grateful for that. And it's just a pleasure to be here this evening, and absolutely an honor to be able to support the wonderful National Museum of the United States Army in this fashion. I hope everyone's been enjoying the program so far. I know everyone worked hard on getting it put together at the museum. And my only wish is that this could have been in person, but I will do my best to ensure that you can hear and see everything that you would see otherwise.
Great. Well, thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and at the end of your presentation, we will open up the floor to audience questions that are from the Q&A. And with that, welcome, and please tell us all about the Great Partnership.
Thank you, John. To begin with, everyone, I would like to mention the primary theses of the book, which serve as an underpinning for this talk. And they will hopefully enlighten you about what exactly I'm trying to say in the book and why this partnership was so significant for the Confederacy and its ultimate fate. I'm going to be focusing this evening on the development of Confederate strategy in the Eastern Theater of Operations, and how did the relationship between Lee and Jackson influence that strategy, which it did very much. So the primary theses of the book are as follows, and some of these may not come as a great surprise to those who are well-read on the history of the Lee-Jackson relationship, and some of them I think will be a surprise to even the most seasoned Civil War readers. Obviously, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson had a professional relationship, and that's been well established by the literature over the years. Douglas Southall Freeman started really making us aware of this, and many subsequent writers since. But in the course of my research for this book, I became more and more convinced that there was a personal relationship as well as the professional, which has really only been touched upon by a few previous authors. The relationship was so deep and so heartfelt that it influenced greatly how the two men worked together and created a bond between them that was extremely tight, so tight that when Jackson is accidentally shot by his own men and dies after the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, that Lee weeps and hides in his tent for some time to try to disguise his incredible discomfort and unhappiness with the loss of his then chief lieutenant. So the first thesis is that there was a strong personal relationship between the two men that enhanced the professional relationship. And a subpoint of that is that the personal relationship was very strongly influenced by a deep common religious faith that both men shared in evangelical Protestantism. They came to their religion from two different denominational perspectives, as many of our listeners and readers know, but they were able to find a very strong common ground in this idea of divine providence, which stated then as today that the Lord controls all events on this earth, and there is a modicum of human agency at work, but in the end, it's the Heavenly Father that makes the final call. And the two men found that common faith, particularly in the winter of 1862 to 1863. So their friendship was undergirded by a strong sense of common religious belief. The second big thesis is that the two men together formulated the best and most successful aspects of Confederate theater strategy in the Eastern Theater at the time that they were together, namely from June 1862 to May of 1863, almost an entire year. They were able to work together in this partnership. It was not a perfect relationship in the military sense. Jackson's strategic thoughts, as I'll explain, were a little too radical in some cases for Robert E. Lee, who was more reserved about what he wanted to do, particularly about making war on the North. But ultimately, Lee came along to see some of Jackson's beliefs and adopted many of them in what would ultimately become the Gettysburg Campaign. But as you know, Jackson was not there with him for that climactic campaign. Another important thesis I bring out in the book has to do with the effect of Jackson's untimely death on Lee and on the Confederacy writ large. Very few previous historians have engaged this, and it's important for us to understand that Jackson's death was seen as a great contingency point in the Confederate nation at the time, from places as distant from one another as Northern Virginia the whole way to Texas, from people as highly ranked as Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, to little children who also could surmise what the death of this chief lieutenant of Lee meant for the efficacy of Robert E. Lee's army, the command team that he had created, and also for the fate of the Confederate nation overall. So it was understood that Jackson's death was a very heavy strategic blow. And then lastly, there's an overarching thesis that I think is important for anyone who is a leader today. And it was one of those purposes that I wrote the book for. I wanted to ensure that leaders of all ilks, whether they be in the military or in government or civic leadership, business leadership, that they could benefit from the study of this relationship. And the basic point is that Jackson served not only as Lee's right-hand man on the battlefield, tactically and operationally, but also was a primary strategic advisor for Robert E. Lee and how he thought about fighting this war. And that's an important takeaway, the close relationship between a strategic leader and a strategic advisor, which the Lee-Jackson relationship represents. And I do have an appendix in which the takeaways of that relationship are elucidated. So we can go to the next slide, please. And keep hitting yeah, there you go. Thank you. So this slide is going to tell us a little bit about some of the basic strategic theory that underpins my theses and my analysis in the book. And the first major point I would bring out for everybody's edification here is the idea of Karl von Clausewitz's definition of war, which is war is merely the continuation of policy by other means. Clausewitz, the great Prussian philosopher of war, upon whose thought much of Western strategic thought then and today rests. He had not yet been translated into English by the time of the Civil War, but the basic intrinsic ideas of Clausewitz were generally understood, even though he himself was not translated nor taught at West Point. There, the future generals of the Civil War learned Jomini. the great French interpreter of Napoleon. Nonetheless, this Clausewitzian maxim was at work throughout the war on both sides, and Robert E. Lee and Jackson particularly understood that there is a political aspect to war, and there are political goals that must be achieved or else the war is useless. For the Confederacy, that major goal, of course, was independence, and whatever could achieve that was acceptable to this partnership, almost anything. The stool there off to the left represents the ends, ways, means paradigm, which we teach at the War College very early in the year. Some of these terms may be familiar to many of you. Ends are your objectives in a given war. Means are the resources that one might have to wield in pursuit of the ends. And I would urge everyone to think beyond just armies and navies and coal mines and factories. Think also in terms of leaders. Gifted leaders, particularly at the strategic level, are extremely hard to find then as today. And when they are knocked out for whatever reason, today it's often retirement that knocks them out. But during the Civil War, the Confederacy had an extremely high attrition rate of strategic level leaders and the high operational level leadership as well. Their bench was smaller than the Union. And in that regard, that's one reason that this partnership was so significant. There was nothing else like it in the entire Confederate war effort in any of the theaters. And ways are your concepts, your methods in which the means are connected to the ends. How are the resources wielded? This is sometimes conflated with the term strategy itself, and really reflects how a nation at war is going to utilize its instruments of national power or elements of national power, which you see represented by the dime below. And at the War College, we break that down into four basic categories: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And I will refer to this as we go through the rest of the presentation. All countries at war of all times and all places have all four aspects. And National Defense University adds financial, intelligence, and law enforcement for the acronym DIME-FIL. I do not disagree with that. I think that the other three fall under the War College's definition of DIME, however. In the middle, you see the three levels of war. And this is important for us to understand very clearly with the corresponding levels of leadership off to the right in that multicolored triangle. Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson had to operate at all three levels of war: tactical, operational, and strategic. And you can see the correspondence there of what level of leadership corresponds with which level of war. Essentially, think of the strategic level of war as the war-winning and war-losing thinking, decision-making, and actions that govern throughout a given conflict. Operational, think in terms of campaigns. The Gettysburg Campaign existed within the greater theater strategy of the Eastern Theater of Operations in the American Civil War, and itself was composed of several tactical events, like the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Chancellorsville existed within the Chancellorsville Campaign. Notice that the rings do intersect with each other, and that is purposeful because there are moments in time, which we call nexus points, in which even the tactical level can stretch up and touch the strategic level of war and affect it. So there are certain times and points, both geographically and chronologically, in a war, and I would argue in the Civil War, this was very frequent, where tactical level events could influence the course of the war itself. And the loss of Jackson, therefore, was supremely significant for the Confederate war effort because the Confederates lost a man who could think at all three levels, as well as work well with Robert E. Lee. And that is not to diminish the significance of Lee's other captains, such as James Longstreet and James Ewell Brown Stuart. But Lee and Jackson got very close, and that personal relationship enhanced this professional working relationship. And the triangle gives you an idea of what kind of leadership we're talking about here. Notice the strategic leader does have to descend to the tactical from time to time. both of our two generals tonight did do that on multiple occasions. Next slide, please. So let's have a recap of what the strategic situation was in the American Civil War by the time of the Chancellorsville Campaign of the late spring of 1863. It was the second full year of the war, and as many of you know, most of the great battles of the Eastern Theater up to this point, with the exception of Antietam, had turned into Confederate victories. That was no small part due to the command team that Robert E. Lee had built following the 7 days. The command team composed of Jackson, Longstreet, and Stuart in particular. And there was nothing that the Union Army of the Potomac at the time could bring forward to match that command team. Of course, Antietam was a setback, but we often forget about the fact that in the Antietam campaign, that was a reverse, and it was a strategic defeat for the Confederacy because of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Harper's Ferry also fell in that operation, and it was Stonewall Jackson who captured it. And over 12,000 Union troops surrendered. It was the biggest surrender of Union troops until the fall of Corregidor in World War II. That was Jackson's doing. And that raised Jackson's star in Lee's eyes very strongly. So in the East, the Confederacy has been winning the war slightly with the Army of Northern Virginia and that command team that I mentioned. But in the West, it's a different story. And you can see here that most of the Mississippi River Valley has fallen to Union arms by this point. Tennessee, 2/3 gone. Missouri is all but lost. Arkansas and Louisiana are both half occupied by Union troops. And Vicksburg is about to be threatened. It's not yet under siege in late April, but Grant is on his way. So in the West, it's very clear that the United States is winning this war. And throw in the blockade of southern ports on top of that, and you have a pretty bad economic situation in the Confederacy, deteriorating railroads, skyrocketing inflation, and now the informational blow of the Emancipation Proclamation, which also damaged the Confederacy's diplomatic prospects, as many of you know. And Lee is very well aware of this, as well as Jackson. The time is ticking against the Confederacy, and therefore something climactic must be done, particularly in the East. Lee and Jackson both believed that the war in the West was all but lost, and it was just a matter of time. And that helps put into perspective some of Lee's decision-making in the spring and summer of 1863, which has been considered myopic by certain modern historians. But if you read the original sources, the letters privately sent by Robert E. Lee to other leaders and to his family, as well as to officials in Richmond, it's pretty evident that he saw the strategic situation very clear-eyed. And that's one reason he didn't want to risk detaching his army and sending it out there, because he knew it wasn't going to do a lot of good. It'd get there late anyway, probably, he thought. So the Union is winning the war in many of the aspects of the dime: diplomatic, informational, economic, by the time of the climactic Chancellorsville campaign in early May of 63. But militarily, it's still a draw. And Lee and Jackson hope that if they can force a climactic victory, a battlefield victory, albeit a tactical one, that could reach up to the high operational level or even the strategic level, a decimation, if you will, of the Army of the Potomac, they might still be able to pull a victory out in the Eastern Theater. But the problem was that Robert E. Lee fell sick in the winter of 1862 to 63 in March, as he and Jackson were making their plans to do exactly this. And by the time Robert E. Lee recovered, this was the sickness that really exacerbated his heart condition, by the way, that would come back to haunt him later at Gettysburg and ultimately kill him 5 years late, well, in 1870. Unfortunately for the Confederates, the Union took the initiative. The Army of the Potomac, under the new commander Joseph Hooker, outflanked Robert E. Lee's outnumbered Army in Northern Virginia outside of Fredericksburg. And Lee did not have his other principal lieutenant, James Longstreet, whom he had sent on detached duty to southeastern Virginia to gather supplies and to watch Union activities down there. which tells us about the dire logistical straits that the Army of Northern Virginia found itself in at this time. They had to detach about a third of their army in order to gather enough supplies to support it. A bad situation, again, indicating that time is ticking away against the seceded South. Next slide. I have a series of period photographs and sketches that are coming now that will give you an idea about what had happened up to April of 1863, in which the partnership between Lee and Jackson began to bloom and flourish. It actually began in the Valley Campaign of 1862, where Jackson wins a series of triumphs against the odds against a series of Union generals and their armies. And Lee and Jackson began to become professionally close during that time, which is an essay I have in the next book coming out in June. But it was after Lee calls Jackson east to fight in the 7 Days Campaign around Richmond that we see their relationship really start to get closer professionally and a bit closer personally. The defeat at Antietam, the check, if you will, represented by these two iconic pictures from Alexander Gardner wartime daguerreotypes, did not diminish the relationship between the two generals. Lee did not think that Jackson underperformed at all. He had done poorly on the 7 days, and Lee had to think about whether or not he wanted to continue to trust Jackson as a principal lieutenant. So he gave him a try in the Cedar Run campaign, or Cedar Mountain, which preceded Second Manassas. And he also gave Jackson an independent command in Second Manassas. Jackson proved him right, that was a wise decision. He did very well in the Second Manassas campaign with the great flank march behind the Union Army. And he did even better at Antietam. Even though it ended in a Confederate reverse, the Lee-Jackson relationship was strengthened. Next slide. These are the principal Union opponents of the Lee-Jackson command team. And each one of these gentlemen was defeated in turn at various points during the almost 1 year that Lee and Jackson worked together. George McClellan and Fitz-John Porter, one of his chief lieutenants, defeated on the peninsula. McClellan later at Antietam. John Pope at Second Manassas, Ambrose Burnside at Fredericksburg, Joe Hooker at Chancellorsville, and his subordinate Oliver Otis Howard, who took the brunt of Jackson's flank attack at Chancellorsville. And we'll talk just a little bit more about Howard later on. Next slide, please. The top image is a 1866 print indicating in a somewhat fanciful manner, Jackson leading prayer in his headquarters camp sometime in 1862 to 1863. And I mention it, I put it in the book for a reason. It does demonstrate the extreme Christian piety that Stonewall Jackson observed, and which in many ways dictated his every move. Previous authors, such as James Robertson, have gone to great length to describe this. My research indicates that Jackson was not a religious fanatic, which is a popular misconception, unfortunately. Robertson tried to dispel it, but to no avail. It's one of those popular things we like to think about. The man was completely off the deep end in his religious convictions. Well, in fact, he was not. He was a little bit off to the side, more than a little bit, I would say, but he wasn't off the charts. He was just further along the scale compared to many other Americans at the time, Protestant Americans, North and South, and also considering themselves evangelical Protestants at that time were men like Abraham Lincoln and Salmon P. Chase in charge of the Union. Oliver Otis Howard, one of the principal corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac, and Robert E. Lee himself, though not as zealous in his Christian faith, coming from an Episcopal background, still believed very strongly in divine providence. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a connection that he shared with Jackson, and they actually did share prayer meetings and Sunday services in the winter camp at Fredericksburg between the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. And the bottom photo is a modern day image of Moss Neck Manor, which was for most of that winter Jackson's headquarters. He had an office on the grounds of the plantation. He refused to take a room inside the spacious mansion. He wanted to be closer to his soldiers. He wanted to not put on airs, very typical to his character. And it was during this time when he had his headquarters there at Moss Neck Manor, just a short horse ride away from Lee's headquarters in the adjacent area. It was during this time that Jackson and Lee began planning what would become later the Gettysburg Campaign, or the Pennsylvania Campaign. They began planning for another invasion of the North. Having been checked at Sharpsburg, both of them wanted to get into the North and wreak some havoc. And I'll explain exactly what those thoughts were, particularly Stonewall Jackson's, which may come as a surprise to some of you. Next slide, please. So before the Great Battle of Chancellorsville, which changed a great deal about the Confederacy's fate, there were three major areas of concentration across the theaters of war where the Confederate national leadership had to pay attention particularly. Obviously, number one represents the dire situation that's developing at Vicksburg, and number two represents the problem in Tennessee. Both the Confederate armies around Vicksburg and in Tennessee under Braxton Bragg were threatened and outnumbered. And the question was, should the Army of Northern Virginia detach perhaps permanently Longstreet's two divisions and send them out to the west? Ultimately, that it does end up happening after Gettysburg. But Robert E. Lee fought strenuously in a series of meetings that occurred in March in Richmond. Yes, indeed, in March. There was a major meeting that occurred in March. Prior to the Battle of Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee goes to Richmond, catches a cold there. It's probably the source of what would later be the illness that laid him out for the rest of the winter and early spring, thus postponing his plans that he had developed with Jackson. And he urges Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, we need to stay concentrated on Zone 3. And we need to ensure that we can do something there in the East, because 1 and 2 are not going to really be helped fast enough if we detach portions of my army. Moreover, he told during this great meeting in March, the Confederate National Command Authority, Jackson and I have a plan, what we're going to do when we get into the North this time. And that's rather significant for us, I think. So next slide, please. What was the Lee-Jackson relationship specifically on the 1st of May, 1863, the beginning of the Great Chancellorsville Campaign? Jackson is now Lee's chief operator, not only because Longstreet is absent, but also because Jackson has earned Lee's respect over the series of previous campaigns. He is also his chief strategic, operational, and tactical advisor. Both wish to bring the war into the North. During that winter of 62-63, Lee and Jackson conferred numerous times privately in Lee's tent. And Jackson had commissioned a map of the counties of Pennsylvania, the southern counties of Pennsylvania and northern Maryland. Jedediah Hotchkiss, his map maker, put it together. Hotchkiss knew the area because he had spent some time before the war in southern Pennsylvania and was able to put together a map. One of Jackson's secrets as a leader is that he usually had good maps. Hotchkiss ensured that. He didn't have it on the peninsula, which is one reason it didn't do as well there. But the plan was that Lee with Jackson would move north as soon as the roads had stopped being oceans of mud, get the jump on the Army of the Potomac in the middle spring, probably in April, and start going into the North and try to get past where they had been stopped before. They wanted to get into Pennsylvania. From 1861 onward, Stonewall Jackson had been urging what would later be called a hard war. And in many ways, he presupposed the kind of hard war that Sherman and Grant would unleash on the Confederacy later on in 1864. Charles Royster worked on this a little bit in a previous work, and it piqued my interest, and it made me wonder, what was it really that Jackson wanted to do? Well, I got into a lot of previously unpublished Jackson letters. I found a lot of correspondence that he had had with Lee that had been out there for some time, but it wasn't recognized for what it was. And what Jackson wanted to do was get into Pennsylvania, wreck the railroads, take Harrisburg, and hit a political blow against Abraham Lincoln thereby. He wanted to terrorize the northern population by his mere presence. And also what he wanted to do was get across the Susquehanna and burn out the major anthracite coal mines that existed in only 3 counties east of the Susquehanna, and which contributed 80% of the North's anthracite coal. This is strategic thinking because it's looking at the strategic means of the North, one of them, which was so significant for the Northern armies and navies to bring the war into the South. If the coal is gone, you can only imagine the effect on the blockade of Southern ports by the Union Navy and the ability of steam locomotives to move the armies into the South. Jackson realized this. He knew there was a vulnerability, a strategic vulnerability. If he could get to the coal mines, which Hotchkiss told him about, and he could burn them out or make them unusable for a period of time, it could really wreak massive strategic havoc with the Union. And I don't have the smoking gun that says he told Lee precisely this. But one thing we know is that Jackson, prior to his death, spoke to many different people on the record about what he wanted to do. And even before he joins Lee on the 7 days on the Virginia Peninsula, he is requesting to be unleashed into the North after a successful Valley campaign with reinforcements. And initially, Lee says yes. But then he has to recall both those reinforcements and Jackson and his army to help defend Richmond from McClellan, who's getting just a little too close. And so Jackson's initial dream is stymied for a little bit. He got stymied again at Antietam, and then they were planning to do this in the spring of 1863, but Lee falls sick, and the whole plan is delayed, and that meant Joe Hooker got to jump on them, initiating the Chancellorsville campaign. Lee was very close with Jackson in a friendship situation. He was one of the commanding general's few friends, and one of the very few people who could make Stonewall Jackson laugh was Robert E. Lee. For that matter, Jeb Stuart also was very close with Stonewall Jackson. And therefore, there was a very solid level of second-tier leadership at Chancellorsville and potentially beyond, I argue, had Jackson managed to survive somehow, that really supported Lee's command style. He did not have to micromanage Jackson or Stuart. He operated on what we call mission command style of order giving, which the U.S. Army today follows and our joint commands follow, in which subordinates are told what is the goal, and then they take care of the details and do it. There is not micromanaging. This was Lee's method. He did not want to tell precisely how a subordinate should perform his duties. He trusted Jackson enough through this professional respect, undergirded by a personal friendship, which itself was underpinned by Christian faith. He knew if he told Jackson to do something, Jackson would do it, and that therefore he could be relied upon. So, next slide, please. What did Jackson mean for the Confederacy? To strike at the other thesis I mentioned at the beginning, what his death actually meant. Well, he had an incredible reputation as a winning general from the Valley. The bungling on the 7 days, in the 7 days campaign on the Virginia Peninsula was really hushed up in the Confederate press. And in fact, the pairing of Jackson in the public's eye with Robert E. Lee began at that time, and his poor performance was really not well known publicly at all. Then suddenly he is winning again at Cedar Mountain and at Second Manassas, and he does well at Harper's Ferry. His mediocre performance at Fredericksburg is glossed over. And so he is seen as Lee's great lieutenant. In fact, he is paired in the public's eye as great as Robert E. Lee is, in many people's opinions. His moral character was also tied to the righteousness of the cause. Now, this was a dangerous trend that the Confederate citizenry was essentially swallowing. If Jackson falls, obviously there will be moral implications, and there will be a doubting in the public about what their cause is and whether or not it is righteous once the great defender of the faith, Stonewall Jackson, is taken away. And so there was this kind of putting him up on a pedestal during the war. And again, these are wartime sources, wartime newspapers, letters, diaries I consulted. This is not post-war lost cause stuff. This is what people thought at the time. They understood as well as value to Lee that he was an integral part of the Army in Northern Virginia command team. He was seen as the protector of the Valley, and he had a very good reputation in the Confederate government in Richmond. It did not start out that way. He had a very cool initial relationship with Jefferson Davis and the early secretaries of war. But by the time of Chancellorsville, he was extremely well liked and regarded in the halls of power in Richmond. Next slide, please. Well, it was not to be. Lee and Jackson's plan to go together into Pennsylvania to try to get into the North a second time would not happen because Stonewall Jackson will die in that little house up there, the Chandler Plantation office at Guinea Station, on May 10th. Many of you understand what happened. Jackson shot by his own men on the night of May 2nd, arguably the apogee of his military career with the successful flank attack at Chancellorsville. And yes, I do write in the book, the Yankees had something to do with that success. They allowed it to occur. But it was the apogee of Jackson's military performance. And then he shot trying to keep the attack going. He probably shouldn't have been where he was. And that's a whole other sub-debate I won't get into. But when the news comes that Jackson is not going to make it, Robert E. Lee wept in his tent. There is quite a lot of evidence of about how broken up he was. If this was just a man that he highly regarded professionally, I doubt he would have had that kind of reaction. Too many source materials from the time indicated how affected Lee was personally as a person with the loss of Jackson, which was a new discovery for me as I did the research for this book. And I think it's important for us to understand that this marble man, Robert E. Lee, was actually truly a man and had feelings and had friendships that mattered to him. And there weren't many in the Army in Northern Virginia in whom he could confide. Jackson was one of them. He did not have that close of relationship with James Longstreet, despite what Longstreet later would write. The bottom picture is a copy of the Jedediah Hotchkiss map that I mentioned earlier, which Lee and Jackson used to plan what would have been their spring campaign into Pennsylvania. That map, which the original is at the Handley Library in Winchester, and there's a copy owned by the Library of Congress. That map was used, however, by Lee's army when it did get into Pennsylvania later on in late June of 1863. Next slide. When Jackson died, the reactions across the Confederacy were so very clear in the newspapers, in diaries, in private letters, within the Army in Northern Virginia, within the Western Confederate armies, in the Confederate citizenry. And this was extremely interesting to me just to see what a breakup this was for the South. One general in the Army in Northern Virginia put it very succinctly, and I have this in the opening to my book. It was the heartbreak of the Confederacy. And the way that the South mourned Jackson's death was a harbinger of how the North would mourn the death of Abraham Lincoln. This was for the Confederates, for the Confederate nation, what the loss of Lincoln was for the Union. Lee, for example, was just absolutely distraught. Who can fill his place? I do not know. He wrote to his son in General Orders number 61 that was distributed to the Army after Jackson's death. He did try to put a bold face on it and said his spirit may be diffused across the command, and hopefully we may be inspired by his great example. But it was clear that Lee was trying to put a brave face on what was absolutely a personal and a professional tragedy. In the Army in Northern Virginia, There were many different phrases used: a national calamity, lots of discussions of these grown men weeping like babies. Some were more stoic: God's will be done. Even Jedediah Hotchkiss, who was so devoted to his chief, took a stoic view of Jackson's demise initially, then later on really regretted his death. One soldier really struck me. He said, "All hopes of peace and independence are vanished forever." And this was echoed in one way or another in dozens of letters that I examined. It wasn't just a few. These are the common themes in the ANV. So the soldiers are thinking this even after they won at Chancellorsville. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis called it a national calamity, and was so taken aback when the news came that Jackson died, because he thought he was going to recover, that he stood in stone cold silence, according to his wife Verena, and could not receive visitors for an entire afternoon. He was that broken up. I think that says something about the value of Jackson to the Confederate leadership. And Secretary of War said his loss is irreparable. And he put that in a public eulogy, which was recorded and placed in the records of the Confederate Congress 2 months after Jackson's death. That's how long this pain lingered. And I would argue it lingered the whole way to the end of the war for many people. In Virginia in particular, both in Richmond and the Valley, the refrain was very similar. "He has fallen and a nation weeps," one newspaper editor reported. And I think that reflects how many people thought in Virginia. The funeral in Richmond was a national level event. People came from out of state to see it. Flowers just so covered the coffin when it laid in the State House in Richmond that it couldn't even be seen after a while. It was just so overwhelmed with these tributes. In the Deep South and in the Carolinas, very similar sentiments were reported, and they kept on going for weeks, well into the end of June, on the eve of the Gettysburg Campaign. "The most serious loss we have yet sustained in the war," said one editor. The term national calamity was repeated by many. Another newspaper editor said he was absolutely invaluable to the cause, and a private letter said, "There is universal gloom here in our small community over the loss of Stonewall." Very interesting were the reactions outside of the Confederacy as well. In England, it was one of the major British newspapers, I believe it was the Times, that said, "This is assuredly the most fatal shot of the war to the Confederates." Well, if the British press is saying this, then again, there must have been some substance to it in the context of the day. And in the North, Oliver Otis Howard would say years later that after his death, General Lee could not replace him. I think that's a tribute coming from a major general in the Union Army. That's fairly significant. Also an evangelical Christian. And Abraham Lincoln wrote a quick note, which is in the Lincoln papers, to the editor of the Washington Morning newspaper, praising him for the good eulogy that he had put in there about Stonewall Jackson. So even the president of the Union was touched by the loss of Jackson and understood its significance. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, folks, probably the greatest significance of the loss of Jackson was what happened to the Army in Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee after he died. And my final chapter deals with this. And I don't engage in the famous what ifs. If Jackson had been at Gettysburg, and would he have attacked Cemetery or Culp's Hill on the night of the 1st of July? I argue that the whole character of the campaign would have been radically different. There might not have been a fight at Gettysburg. Jackson would have demanded Jeb Stuart escort his part of the army into Pennsylvania if he had made it past his amputation and had been in the movement north. There was no guarantee that a recovering Jackson would have gone north with Lee. I think he probably would have. But the whole character would have been very different, and beyond that is speculation. One thing we do know are the effects of Jackson's death on the Army Northern Virginia itself. A massive reorganization occurred, which many of you know. I went from the two-wing structure under Longstreet and Jackson, with Stuart as head of cavalry, to the three-corps system under Longstreet, Ewell, and A.P. Hill, Stuart still in command of cavalry. The problem here is that Ewell and Hill were former Jackson generals. They had served under Jackson. They were used to his command style, which was very punctilious, very direct, and very precise. And if you didn't follow what he told you to do precisely, you were put up on charges and court-martials, which A.P. Hill experienced twice. Ewell had been out of the Army for 9 months following his wound at 2nd Manassas. So you have these two guys elevated, Ewell and Hill, arguably beyond their capacity for command. They had a week and a half to get adjusted to their new level of responsibility. Lee had the same amount of time to get used to the fact that Jackson wasn't going to be around before he had to start planning the movement north. And he had to start planning at the time in order to take the initiative from the Union and be able to monopolize upon the victory at Chancellorsville. So none of the Army of Northern Virginia's high command had time to adjust to the loss of Jackson. Stuart was also very badly affected with what probably was the equivalent of PTS, having lost his dear friend, Stonewall Jackson. And he wrote to Jackson's widow right after the loss of Stonewall, saying, I have lost the dearest friend that I ever had. That's how he wrote to Marianna Jackson about her husband, which tells you that Stuart was broken up. Did that influence him in his wild ride around the Union Army? It might have been a factor. Again, that's speculation, but there's no question that the loss of Jackson totally changes the character of the ensuing Pennsylvania campaign, and then opens up branches and sequels that would not have otherwise happened if Jackson had lived. I would invite anyone interested in what those branches and sequels might have been to take a look at my final chapter, where I do go into that. And that is, I believe, the end of my presentation this evening for you. You can go to the next slide, and it'll show you, and keep forwarding past that. That indicates Jackson's death. There you can see, of course, the campaign plan as it unfolded. Lee would get into Pennsylvania, but not with Stonewall Jackson, the man whom he had planned this invasion with. And that, folks, made all the difference. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Chris, thanks very much for that presentation. Very, very well done. Appreciate it. And we're going to jump right into the questions here because we've got several lined up. Folks, if you are interested in asking a question, please use the Q&A function and not the chat. It's a lot easier to be able to read the questions. So let's start out with the first one. How does the relationship and partnership between Lee and Jackson compare to that between Lee and Longstreet? Was one partnership more impactful than the other? How are they different?
That's an excellent question, John, and I do handle it in the book. And the short answer, in the interest of time here, so we can get to some other questions, is that both were highly significant relationships for the efficacy of the command team of the Army of Northern Virginia and for Lee himself. Jackson and Lee enjoyed a much closer personal relationship, I discovered, than that existed between Longstreet and Lee. Longstreet will reassume primacy as Lee's chief lieutenant, a position that he had enjoyed for a period of time before Jackson comes on the scene. And in fact, after Jackson's bungling during the 7 days, and Longstreet is in the ascendancy. After Jackson's performance, particularly in the Sharpsburg-Antietam campaign, Lee comes to see Jackson and Longstreet as equals. And I do trace the evolution of this in the book. By the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and particularly in the months thereafter, Jackson supersedes Longstreet in Lee's esteem. And part of that is because of Longstreet's behavior on detached duty. All of this is in the official records, and you can see how snippy he gets with his boss in letters back to Robert E. Lee. It borders on the insubordinate, and Lee picked up on it. But being gracious and being careful, he doesn't chide Longstreet too much, but it's very clear how he deals with him in these letters, that he thinks Longstreet isn't doing as well as he should. And in the meantime, he's having almost daily conferences with Stonewall Jackson and attending church services with him. So that relationship got intensely close during those months of Longstreet's absence. When Jackson dies, Longstreet reassumes his position.
Thanks. Let's go back to something you mentioned very briefly, which is the 7 days. And the question here is, given the underperformance of Jackson during the 7 days, Lee took a big chance by giving him another shot at it after the 7 days was up and at the beginning of the Second Manassas campaign, which Lee did not really do for several other generals. Was this primarily because of Jackson's performance during the Valley campaign?
Yes, I think it was. I definitely believe that had left such a lasting effect on Lee professionally. And it became known to Lee through Jackson's performance. I'm sure the staff officers talked with each other as their staffs intermingled during the 7 days. And when Lee and Jackson met, Jackson was physically tired. Of course he was. He had just, fought that climactic campaign and then had ridden a good part of the distance from Central Virginia to just south of Richmond to Lee's headquarters. And then he rode back after the initial conference in which they agreed how and where he would bring his Valley Army to join the newly christened Army in Northern Virginia. The man was completely worn out. I think Lee knew that. And I think but he was disappointed. I mean, Stuart came right out, and there's a letter in which Stuart indicates that the boss was disappointed in Jackson in the 7 days. But I think that he realized this was not really the typical Jackson that we saw there. And other authors have argued similar things. Bob Crick has said this and a few others. I agree with them. I think Jackson will recover his health after the 7 days and do better. And he gets better and better the longer he goes. Cedar Mountain was kind of close run against none other than Nathaniel Banks. But it's still a victory. And Lee then begins to get his professional esteem in Jackson restored.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Another good question here is that there's been some inference and some historical thought that Jackson was highly successful when operating independently, but much less so when operating in concert with other Confederate forces. Do you think there's any validity in that?
No, I think that he did very well in the Valley for really two reasons. He knew the Valley personally, and he had great maps, far superior to those of his opponents. And I think his men had something to do with it too. And the state of the Union leadership, but it wasn't as bad as some people have popularly thought. There have been some new books that have said the Union leadership in the Valley wasn't as bad as previously believed. But those are the two big reasons he did well in the Valley. And I think they're unique to that particular context during the war. When he comes over to join Lee in the Peninsular Campaign and then sticks with him, Jackson was very happy to continue to serve under Robert E. Lee and went down on record numerous times indicating he didn't want to leave Lee's side. The friendship it went both ways. Jackson very much revered his chief, but also enjoyed Lee's company. And he didn't want to leave him once he had joined him with his army. He wanted to stay with him. He thought that was his rightful place. It's where he should be. It was considered for a moment that he might retake independent command in the Valley after the Fredericksburg campaign, and he very quickly squashed that. He said, "I do not want to leave my general." And that speaks volumes. And I think he was extremely effective in Lee's command team. I think he was one of the great foundational reasons that the command team under Robert E. Lee flourished for as long as it did. After his death, it became very clear to anybody that was paying attention that it was a disaster.
Right. Professor Russ Weigley, this is one of the questions from one of our CMH historians, used to talk about Lee and Jackson as Napoleonic generals. How much did these two actually study Napoleonic campaigns And were they interested in history, or did they follow a popular concept of Napoleon that they adapted to their own temperaments?
That's an excellent question. I liked your qualification at the end there, John. They're both Jominians, which means that they followed the precepts of Baron Antoine de Jomini, the great interpreter of Napoleon, whose theories were taught in a watered down form at West Point prior to the war. However, as I write in the book, not only do they display Napoleonic traits as interpreted through Jomini, but they also display Clausewitzian traits at the strategic level of thinking. Particularly, Robert E. Lee understands that war is policy by other means, and therefore the home front and the battlefront are inextricably connected, and a great climactic victory over the Army of the Potomac will shatter Northern morale and might kick Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans out of office. It might take some time, but that was a political effect that he hoped for. Jackson thought the same way. He just wasn't as precise about it, and there aren't as many surviving letters that speak directly to that. But he too was thinking strategically, like Clausewitz, in terms of logistics. As I indicated, burn out the coal mines and the Northern armies and navies come to a screeching halt. That's strategic level thinking. Bring terror into the North to affect the people's thinking about this war effort. Those are Jackson thoughts. Those are strategic level thoughts. So they were Jominians, but they also had an understanding in an intrinsic sense, though they never studied him, of Clausewitz, who's a strategic level theorist. And that would be my answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me combine a couple questions here because they're very similar, and one that I actually was going to ask you as well is, Jackson has often been criticized for being secretive among his own senior leaders, to the point that it left them very limited in their ability sometimes to react to unforeseen contingencies, and that he didn't mentor his subordinates. You mentioned already A.P. Hill, but there's a long list starting with Dick Garnett and others that he, Richard Taylor, didn't share a lot of information with. Ewell in the beginning of the Valley Campaign. What is your opinion on that? Was he too secretive? Was he a good mentor, role model, trainer? What do you think?
Well, that's a great point. I bring that up in the book. He was a bit of a martinet, and he was the devil to work for. I mean, this guy was not a fun boss to work for. There's no question. And the historical record is pretty clear. A lot of biographers have made that point. I do not dispute that at all. I think he was hard to work for. But I think if you did your duty and you did it diligently and you followed the orders that you were given, you got on Jackson's good side. And once you were on his good side, you had to malperform a couple times to really get back in the doghouse or get into the doghouse. Hill had the misfortune of making a few too many mistakes and got in the doghouse with Jackson. I do think that he was not a very good mentor. The modern U.S. military puts great stock, and rightly so, in mentorship and building good subordinates, because one might meet with an accident and you're going to need someone to rise up and take your position. Well, Jackson was not very proficient at that. And part of that was due to his secretive nature. Part of that was due to the fact he was always on campaign, was too busy to mentor. Lee also didn't have a lot of time to do that. And that's part of the reason Ewell and Hill underperform in the Gettysburg Campaign, because they didn't get any mentorship from Lee to speak of. And they got none from Jackson before. So yeah, that was an issue. So there's no question from that standpoint that he had some issues and was problematic as a leader. He gave it all to God and let God's will control things. Didn't give a lot of thought to what would befall the Army and the Confederacy once God called him home.
Mm-hmm. So by 1863, and certainly by the time that Vicksburg fell, the command situation in the Western theater really had reached rock bottom, with animosities between Bragg and Hardee and Polk. Breckinridge was thrown into that mix too, Joe Johnston, and as you know, of course, the effort to find a suitable Robert E. Lee of the West was a continual problem for Jefferson Davis. And I know this is something of a hypothetical, but would Jackson have been considered, had he survived Chancellorsville or however long, would he have been considered for the command in the West at all? Or was he too associated with Lee's success to kind of lose him?
Another great question. I've gotten that a couple times over the last year and a half. Jackson would have probably declined if he had been offered the command. He wanted to stay with Lee. Personal and professional reasons, as I mentioned, dictated that thinking in him. He did not want to leave his general and his friend. And well, his friends, because Stuart was probably even closer to him. And he did not want to go out of the Eastern Army. If he had been commanded and Lee had said, "You are going to go," he would have followed orders and he would have done it. Mm-hmm. So he would have been considered, but I think Lee would have worked rather hard and diligently to follow his friend's wishes to not be transferred and to follow his own wishes. Lee knew that his army was far more effective with the command team of Jackson and Longstreet and Stuart in it. And if you take one of them out, there's going to be an issue. And that is part of the reason writ large why the Army of Northern Virginia does not perform as well in later campaigns, because Jackson's gone, Stuart dies shortly after the advent of the Overland Campaign, and Longstreet is very badly wounded. Well, now, who do you have then to rise to take their place? The Army of Northern Virginia runs into a similar problem that the Western Confederate armies earlier ran into. The only difference is they still had Lee to command them, which did make a difference. But I think Jackson would have resisted going out west, and I think Lee would have as well.
All right. Well, we're going to ask one more question and then wrap it up with a favor that we'll ask of you. The first question is, or the last question, did Lee and Jackson have any relationship before the Civil War?
Another good question, and I bring that up very briefly at the beginning of the book. They knew of each other. They probably ran into each other in Mexico in the Mexican War, but they weren't friends. As officers in the pre-war Army from Virginia who had both attended West Point, they did know of each other. They may have run into each other on a couple occasions in the antebellum time, but there's no evidence I found, nor any other chronicler that I consulted, that indicated there was a very, a close relationship of any kind. But they knew each other. They knew each other's reputation. Lee knew that Jackson was at VMI as a professor before the war, and Jackson was very well aware of Robert E. Lee's antebellum position as colonel of the 2nd Cavalry. And then later on, elevating himself, and well, he was elevated as essentially de facto general-in-chief and advisor, chief military advisor to the president, to Jefferson Davis at the beginning of the war. Right. So yeah, they knew of each other, but it was not a close relationship.
Okay. Would you please, as a few people have asked me to ask you, restate the title of the upcoming book on Southern strategy that you have coming out?
Right. It's called Southern Strategies: Why the Confederacy Failed. It's being published by the University Press of Kansas. I am the editor of the volume. It's coming out in June. You can pre-order it now on Amazon or on the press website. And it's entirely written by me and by former War College students, a couple I noticed who tuned in tonight. Hello, folks. And also some former colleagues. So it's an all War College production. It interprets Confederate defeat using the dime theory that I mentioned at the beginning. and looks at all aspects of Confederate failure, an emphasis on the military, but we look at diplomacy, we look at the economic issues, we look at informational and intelligence shortcomings, and we look at the Trans-Mississippi as well. So fans of the Trans-Mississippi, there's an excellent essay on that in there as well, and why that was so integral to Confederate defeat, that theater.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Sounds great. All right, Christian Keller, professor of history at the U.S. Army War College, Washington and Lee graduate, fraternity brother of mine. We appreciate you being here, and we enjoyed having you very, very much. So on behalf of the National Museum of the U.S. Army, I thank you very much. I would also like to thank our audience. We had a big crowd tonight. We had some great questions, and we really appreciate seeing all the folks that came to view and listen and learn, particularly our docents, our volunteers, but other folks out there from all over the place. So thanks very much. Please join us tomorrow, folks, on Thursday. You can check out our schedule on our website. We have a late afternoon program for teachers and educators. It starts at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And then we have the last of our scholarly academic presentations tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern time, by Frank O'Reilly, a long-term Park Service ranger, historian, interpreter, who is known for his expertise on the Battle of Fredericksburg. And he is going to enlighten us all about Ambrose Burnside. So that should be pretty interesting. So please join us. And again, Chris, thanks very much. And to all of you out there, have a good evening and hope to see you down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, John.